I'm your attorney. We start with the traffic camera footage.
Have we met before?
I'm only here because of the case, Mr. Caldwell.
That bracelet? Why does it look familiar?
We should focus on the file.
Mason still hasn't looked away from Harper. A question hanging on his lips he isn't brave enough yet to ask. But Harper, better than anyone, knows this. This case was never random. What secret is hiding behind that composed attorney's mask? Watch to find out. I don't have anywhere else tonight. That was all she said. 6 words spoken so quietly that Ryan Caldwell almost missed them under the drumming of rain on the garage roof. He turned around with his keys still in the door, and there she was. 15 years old, folded up small on the cracked plastic chair in the waiting room, like she was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. Her jacket was soaked through, her hair was plastered flat against her forehead, and her eyes. That was the part that stopped him cold. Her eyes were dry. Not one tear, just a kind of stillness that no 15-year-old should already know how to wear. Portland gets rain in November the way some towns get gossip. Steady, relentless. Never really stopping, just changing how hard it falls. Caldwell Auto Repair sat on S. Eat Foster Road with its neon sign buzzing weak and orange through the wet dark. One letter flickering so bad it looked like it might give up on being a sign altogether. Ryan had locked that door 1,000 nights. He'd never once found a stranger waiting for him on the other side of it. He should have called someone, a shelter. That was the sensible thing, and Ryan Caldwell had spent his whole adult life being the sensible thing. But then he glanced through the office doorway where his son Mason, 8 years old, mouth open, one sock on, was passed out on the sofa surrounded by comic books he was too old to still be reading. Past him, through the little window, Ryan could see the kitchen table in the house out back, 2 chairs pushed in neat, 1 chair pulled out permanently, like it was waiting on somebody who wasn't coming. He didn't decide to help her. He simply couldn't decide not to. "Come on, then," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it. "Just tonight." She followed him without a word, dripping a thin trail across the concrete floor past the workbench where a 1967 Mustang sat gutted and waiting for parts that hadn't come in yet, its navy paint dulled under a drop cloth. She paused there for half a second, looking at that car the way some people look at a church. That first night, she wouldn't tell him her name until almost midnight, sitting at his kitchen table over a grilled cheese sandwich she ate like she hadn't eaten anything hot in days. Harper. Just Harper. No last name offered, and Ryan, God help him, didn't push. He should have known that night would turn into a week. He couldn't have guessed the week would turn into 2.5 years. Harper stayed. Nobody made a formal decision about it. It simply became true the way seasons become true, one ordinary day folding into the next until the leaves have already changed. She learned to change the oil on a Buick before she learned to parallel park. She learned that Ryan took his coffee black and his silence seriously, and that neither one meant he didn't care. In the gravel lot behind the shop, Mason taught her free throws at a hoop bolted to the fence, and she taught him how to fold a paper airplane that actually flew straight. A fair trade, he figured. She carved a little wooden sign with a rusty nail one Sunday afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the shop floor, with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Family only, Ryan Mason and Harper. Ryan nailed it above the workbench without saying much of anything, which, from him, was practically a speech. He made her a bracelet once out of an old steel bolt he'd sanded down smooth over 3 nights after closing. She never took it off. Not once, not even to sleep. Behind the tool cabinet, pinned where only Ryan ever looked, hung a drawing Harper had made with a grease pencil during her first month. 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one, a short one, a middle one with long hair. He never took it down. Every evening, without fail, Ryan left a sandwich and a glass of milk out on the counter after Harper had gone to bed, even on the nights she said she wasn't hungry. Every morning the plate was empty. But somewhere in a filing cabinet in his office, unopened, sat a letter from a real estate developer about the land his shop sat on. He'd thrown the first one straight in the trash, and his insurance policy, the one covering the shop, the house, everything he had, was carried at the bare legal minimum because that was what he could afford, and Ryan Caldwell had never once in his life planned as if the ground beneath him might actually give way. It gave way on a Tuesday. A woman from the Department of Human Services stood in his kitchen with a clipboard and a kind, tired voice, explaining paperwork Ryan didn't fully hear over the sound of his own heartbeat. There had been no adoption, no custody transfer, just a good man doing a good thing quietly for 2.5 years without ever making it official, and now the system had finally caught up to what he hadn't done. He signed where she told him to sign. His hand did not shake, which surprised him because everything else in his chest was shaking plenty. Harper stood on the porch afterward in the rain. The same rain that had brought her to him, watching him through the screen door like she already knew how this story was supposed to end. "You're leaving me too," she said. Not a question, just a fact delivered flat and certain like she'd rehearsed it in her head 100 times before finding the courage to say it out loud. Ryan didn't explain. He couldn't. She got into the state car without looking back, and he just stood there gripping the hem of his flannel shirt so hard his knuckles went white, watching the taillights disappear down S. East Foster Road into the wet dark, taking with them the only thing that had made the empty chair at his table make sense. He never once imagined that 12 years later, that same girl would walk back through his life wearing a blazer instead of a soaked-through jacket, carrying a briefcase instead of nothing at all, and that the next time she said his name out loud in a room full of strangers, it would be the thing that saved everything he had left. 12 years is a long time to keep a promise nobody asked you to make. Caldwell Auto Repair was still standing on Southeast Foster Road, neon sign still buzzing, though it flickered on only one letter now instead of two. Ryan Caldwell was 39, broader in the shoulders and grayer at the temples, running the shop with just one full-time set of hands beside his own. His son Mason, 20 years old now, gangly and soft-spoken, still learning to trust his own opinions out loud. The empty chair at the kitchen table had never been put away. It just sat there, year after year, dusted every Sunday for reasons Ryan never explained and Mason never asked about. Next door, their neighbor, Miss Betty, who'd lived on S.E. Foster Road longer than the shop had existed, liked to tease Ryan over the fence about it. "That chair's gonna outlive us both, Ryan Caldwell," she'd say, watering her tomatoes in her housecoat. He'd just nod and go back inside, same as always. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Mason took the shop's newly restored '67 Mustang, the same Navy Mustang that had sat gutted under a drop cloth 12 years earlier, out for a test drive to deliver it to a customer over in the Pearl District. At the intersection of Southeast Powell Boulevard and Southeast 82nd Avenue, a black SUV pulled out from a side street and struck the Mustang's front quarter panel. Nobody was seriously hurt. That should have been the end of it. Mason walked around the shop for days afterward, like a man carrying something heavy he couldn't set down. He kept replaying the intersection in his head, the light, the SUV, the half-second before impact, until he wasn't sure anymore what he'd actually seen and what fear had rewritten. He spilled coffee across a customer's invoice trying to pour with shaking hands, and Ryan, without a word, just slid him a fresh form and refilled his mug. That was as close as either of them came to talking about it. But the SUV's driver, a man named Derek Voss, climbed out holding his neck, and within days, 2 separate storms broke over the Caldwell family at once. Voss filed a civil suit at the Multnomah County Courthouse against the shop itself, claiming negligent supervision and seeking damages large enough to bury Caldwell Auto Repair for good. And based on the same disputed traffic report, the county referred Mason for a reckless driving charge, a criminal matter running on its own separate clock, regardless of how the civil case turned out. Ryan sat alone in the shop office that night, staring at a stick figure drawing gone yellow with age pinned behind the tool cabinet, where it had hung for over a decade. He wasn't sleeping. He was doing math instead. How many months of savings he had left, how many days until the first hearing, and neither number gave him much comfort. What Ryan didn't know yet was that somewhere across town, on the 14th floor of a law office on Southwest 5th Avenue, a name on a case file had just stopped a young attorney cold. Harper Quinn was 27 now, sharp-eyed and precise in the way people become when they've had to build their own safety net from scratch. She was scrolling through new intake files when she saw it. Caldwell. Her coffee went cold in her hand while she read the rest of the page twice. She requested the case pro bono that same afternoon, and when her supervising partner asked why, she gave him a two-word answer: personal reasons and nothing more. Nobody at that firm knew Harper Quinn had once been a 15-year-old girl asleep on a plastic chair in a garage waiting room. She'd built her whole adult life so that nobody would ever have to know the good college, the honors on the diploma, the careful blazers, the voice she'd trained out of any trace of the girl who used to smell like motor oil and grilled cheese. She had gotten very good at being someone new. She hadn't expected a case file to threaten to undo 12 years of that work in a single afternoon. The first meeting was set at the shop itself. Harper walked in wearing a dark blazer, her hair pulled back low and neat, a briefcase in one hand, and on her wrist, half hidden under her sleeve, an old steel bracelet that had never once in 12 years come off. Ryan looked up from the workbench and went very still, the way a man goes still when he's not sure if he's looking at a memory or a ghost. Mason, standing beside him, felt a strange tug of familiarity he couldn't place, like the first few notes of a song he used to know every word to. He didn't say anything. 12 years changes a face more than it changes a heart, but apparently not quite enough to erase it completely. There was no hello. No, do you remember me? Harper set her folder down on the workbench next to a socket wrench that hadn't moved in an hour, and said in a voice she'd practiced flat and even in the mirror that morning, "I'm your attorney. We start with the traffic camera." The silence that followed lasted longer than either of them could have measured. Ryan wanted to ask her a dozen things. Where did you go? Are you all right? Why now? He asked none of them. His throat simply wouldn't cooperate. The days that followed moved fast and hard. The opposing side produced a traffic report claiming the light had been red, along with a paid witness who swore Mason had been speeding through the intersection. Ryan began to believe, quietly and completely, that he was going to lose everything. The shop, the house behind it, the only life he'd built since his wife had died. Some nights he sat alone in the garage at 2 a.m, one hand resting on the Mustang's hood, whispering the same broken apology into the dark over and over. "I'm sorry, kid. I'm sorry." Harper worked past 3 and 4 in the morning most nights that week, poring over transportation records and old zoning documents, though she never once explained to Mason or Ryan why a stranger's case had become the only thing she seemed able to think about. One evening, Mason came out to lock up and found her standing very still in front of the old wooden sign nailed above the workbench, "Family Only, Ryan, Mason, and Harper." The paint faded almost to nothing after 12 Portland winters. She reached out and touched the last name with one finger so lightly it barely counted as a touch at all, then pulled her hand back fast, like the letters had scalded her. Mason's eyes moved from the carved word Harper to the woman standing in front of it, and something clicked into place, quiet and certain, like a socket finally finding its bolt. He didn't say anything, not yet. Some things he was starting to understand needed to be let alone until they were ready to be said out loud by somebody other than him. Something else was happening beneath the surface of the case, something none of them could quite name. Every document Harper pulled seemed to circle back again and again to the same phrase buried in old city permit files. Proposed Development S.E. Foster Corridor. It was there in a letter from 3 years back. It was there in a zoning inquiry from 18 months ago. It was there, most strangely of all, in a records request filed the very week the accident happened. She didn't say anything about it yet. Not to Ryan, not to Mason, not even to herself. Not fully, because the shape the pattern was starting to take felt too large, too deliberate, and too close to the only home she'd ever really had to say out loud before she was sure. But late that night, walking back to her car, under a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain, Harper Quinn understood one thing with total certainty. This had never been a simple accident at all. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine, the manila folder heavy in her lap, and thought about a bolt metal bracelet and a chair that never got put away. Whatever she was about to uncover, it was going to cost somebody. She just didn't yet know how much or who. And whatever it actually was, it was about to blow the whole case wide open, starting with 12 seconds of missing traffic footage that nobody was supposed to notice was gone. Harper walked into that garage and let Ryan believe she was just his attorney. No explanation, no remember me, nothing. Team smart strategy or team she owed him the truth first, drop your verdict below. The preliminary hearing room at the Multnomah County Courthouse smelled like old wood polish and nerves. Derek Voss sat at the plaintiff's table looking supremely comfortable, the way men look when they've never once had to worry about losing. His attorney presented the traffic report. First light was red, they claimed, followed by a witness who swore hand over heart that he'd watched Mason's Mustang blow through the intersection at reckless speed. Ryan sat stiff in the gallery, his face gone the color of old drywall. Mason stared at his own hands folded in his lap, unable to look up, already halfway to believing the version of the story where he was the one who'd ruined everything. Beside him, Ryan's knee bounced under the bench, a nervous habit he thought he'd broken 30 years ago, back when his own father used to sit him down at kitchen tables not unlike this room. Hard chairs, harder silences. The witness, a heavy-set man in a windbreaker 2 sizes too big, kept his eyes fixed somewhere above the judge's head as he testified, the way people do when they've rehearsed a story so many times, it no longer feels like lying to them anymore. Then Harper stood. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. The city's traffic camera, she said, is missing exactly 12 seconds of footage from the moment of impact. A murmur moved through the gallery. The judge leaned forward. Harper laid the raw server log from the Portland Bureau of Transportation on the table, page by page, methodical as a woman diffusing something. The timestamp gap was right there in black and white, 12 seconds gone, right where the light should have shown its true color, and what remained on either side of that gap told its own story clearly enough. The light had been green. Voss's attorney tried to recover, call it a technical glitch, a coincidence, nothing more. Harper simply looked at him and said nothing, which somehow did more damage than an argument would have. But she wasn't finished. Not close. The false report wasn't filed by accident, she said, and now there was something new underneath her calm, something sharpened. It was altered 47 minutes after the collision by a city records clerk named Kevin R. She placed a second document down, a time-stamped access log, a name. And 48 hours before the accident, Harper continued, Mr. R received a payment from a shell company registered to Voss Development Group. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that you could set a glass down on. Derek Voss sat up a little straighter in his chair, and for the first time since the hearing began, something flickered behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. It looked almost like fear, if fear ever bothered dressing itself in a $5,000 suit. Harper let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, the same way Ryan used to let a customer sit with an estimate before explaining why the repair cost what it cost. She'd learned patience from him without ever realizing where she'd learned it. Mr. R has since submitted a sworn statement, she added, confirming the alteration was made under duress. We'll get to why in a moment. A ripple went through the reporters seated along the back wall. Pens moving fast now, and the judge asked for order twice before the room settled. Ryan turned to look at Harper. 12 years, and he had never once seen her eyes look anything but guarded, careful, closed like a shop after hours. Now, for just a moment, they weren't closed at all. They were afraid, but not for herself. Harper wasn't done. She reached into her folder one more time, and this time, her hands, usually so steady, trembled just slightly at the edges of the paper. Your Honor, I'd like to enter one more piece of evidence. She paused, and in that pause, 12 years of quiet questions finally found their answer. A history of formal purchase inquiries filed by Voss Development Group against the property at 4218 Southeast Foster Road spanning the last 2.5 years. She read the dates aloud. The first inquiry, the second denied, The third denied again, each one a little more aggressive than the last, each one addressed to a man who had never once considered selling the only home his family had ever had. "This was never a personal injury case," Harper said, and her voice for the first time all morning cracked just slightly at the very end of the sentence. "This was never about a neck injury or a red light. This was an attempt to force a family-owned business into bankruptcy so the land beneath it could be acquired for a fraction of its value." The color drained slowly from Derek Voss's face, a shade at a time, like watching weather change. Behind Ryan, a reporter's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. The judge, who had presided over more property disputes than she could count, took off her glasses slowly, the way people do when they need a second to actually believe what they just heard. She hadn't taken this case for a stranger, and some part of her had known that from the moment she saw the name Caldwell on an intake file. Underneath the composed attorney was still the girl who'd once believed people only kept you around as long as you were useful to them, and proving in front of a room full of strangers that a powerful man had tried to destroy a good one for nothing more than land was in some buried way proof that goodness itself wasn't naive after all. If she could save this family from being erased the way she'd once feared she would be, maybe the 12 years she'd spent convincing herself she needed no one could finally stop being true. Harper kept going because stopping now would have meant giving Voss's attorney room to breathe, and she had learned a long time ago at a kitchen table on S.E. Foster Road that you didn't let up until the job was actually finished. Mr. Voss's company filed 3 separate purchase inquiries on this property, she said. Each one more aggressive than the last, and each one denied. The collision occurred 9 days after the third denial. That is not a coincidence Your Honor can reasonably overlook. Derek Voss's jaw tightened. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, and Voss waved him off without looking away from Harper, like he was trying to place her, trying to understand how a stranger had walked into his courtroom and unraveled 2.5 years of careful planning in under 10 minutes. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. Why would he? The last time anyone connected to that property had seen her, she'd been 15 years old and soaked to the bone in a garage waiting room. He had no reason to know her name, no reason to know she'd once carved "family only" into a wooden sign with a rusty nail. No reason to know that this case was never for her, just a file number. But Ryan knew. Ryan sat in that gallery with his heart hammering so loud he could hear it in his own ears, watching the woman who had once been a scared girl on his sofa dismantle a small empire, built to take everything from him, and for one dizzying second, 12 years folded up small enough to fit inside a single courtroom. The judge called for a recess to review the new evidence, and the room erupted into motion reporters, murmuring attorneys, huddling, the low roar of a story that had just gotten a great deal bigger than anyone walking in that morning had expected. Ryan pushed through the crowd toward the front. He didn't care about protocol. He didn't care who was watching. "Harper?" he said, and it was the first time he'd said her name to her face in 12 years. It came out cracked, disbelieving, like a man testing whether a word he'd been afraid to use might still be allowed. She turned. For just a second, the composed attorney fell away, and underneath was someone much younger, someone in the back seat of a state car watching a flickering neon sign shrink smaller and smaller in the rain until it finally disappeared. "Not now," she said softly, gathering her files with hands that weren't quite steady. "Please, not now. There's more, and it's worse than this." Ryan's stomach dropped. "Worse how?" Harper didn't answer right away. She looked past him toward the courtroom doors where Mason stood, pale and silent, still not fully understanding what had just happened to save him or what it might yet cost the woman who'd just done it. "Derek Voss doesn't lose gracefully," Harper finally said. "He's going to come back harder than this, and when he does, it isn't going to stay in that courtroom." She was right to be afraid. Because by morning, the very thing that had just saved Mason would put someone else's life directly in the crosshairs. And it wasn't going to be Ryan's. It was going to be hers. Ryan watched her walk away down the marble hallway, briefcase in hand, shoulders squared like a woman bracing against a wind only she could feel. He thought of the girl who used to fall asleep with grease still under her fingernails, who used to eat grilled cheese like it was the first hot meal of her life, and he wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, what exactly 12 years had cost her to become the woman who had just walked into a courtroom and torn a millionaire's scheme apart without raising her voice once. Whatever it was, he was about to find out it had cost her more than he could have imagined. By nightfall, Derek Voss had quietly withdrawn the civil suit. No apology, no admission, just a one-line filing from his attorney, and the whole property scheme folded up as fast as it had been assembled, like a poker player pushing away from a table the moment the cards turned against him. Ryan read the notice twice at the kitchen counter, half convinced there was a catch buried somewhere in the legal language. There wasn't. Not in that document anyway. Voss had simply decided that a quiet retreat was cheaper than a public investigation, and men like Voss, Ryan was about to learn, rarely retreated without also finding some other way to win. For one evening, the shop felt almost like it used to. Ryan Mason and Harper sat around the old kitchen table, the one with the fourth chair always pulled out, and for a few hours, nobody talked about lawsuits or land or 12 missing seconds of footage. Mason actually laughed at something. A real laugh, the first one Ryan had heard out of him in weeks. Ryan looked at Harper like he wanted to say something important, something that had been sitting in his chest for over a decade. But the words stayed exactly where they were. Some doors once closed that long don't open just because the weather's finally cleared. It didn't last long. Within days, the county prosecutor's office called. The criminal charge against Mason, reckless driving, filed separately from the civil case weeks earlier, riding on the same discredited red light report, hadn't been dropped. It was still moving forward, working its way toward a hearing date that suddenly felt very close. Mason stood in the kitchen doorway that morning, still in yesterday's shirt, and said the thing Ryan had been dreading since the day the DHS van pulled away 12 years earlier. "Let me take the plea, Dad." His voice didn't shake, which somehow made it worse. "A couple years is better than losing the shop. I can't watch you lose this place too. Not after everything." Ryan looked at his son, 20 years old, standing exactly the way he used to stand at 8, chin up, trying so hard to be brave that it broke something in Ryan's chest to watch. He remembered that same chin jutted out the same stubborn way the morning Mason had insisted he could ride his bike without training wheels down the slope of the shop's gravel lot. He'd fallen then, too. Ryan had picked him up that time. He didn't know how to pick him up from this. For one terrible silent moment, Ryan almost nodded. His mouth actually opened around the shape of the word okay. "I don't know what else to do anymore," he whispered instead. And it cost him more to say those 7 words than it had ever cost him to say anything in his life. That was the moment everyone in that kitchen believed for just a breath that the story was going to end in the worst possible way. Then it got worse, because whatever relief the withdrawn lawsuit had bought them evaporated by lunchtime, when word came that Mason could be taken into custody within days pending the next hearing. 12 hours earlier, they'd been laughing around a kitchen table. Now Ryan sat with his hands pressed flat against his eyes, trying to hold up a ceiling that felt like it was already coming down. And 2 miles away, on the 14th floor of a law office on S.W. 5th Avenue, Harper's phone rang. It was a senior partner. His voice was pleasant, professional, and absolutely unyielding. "Drop the Caldwell case," he told her. "Voss has friends in places you don't want to test. Keep pushing, and it isn't just this case that ends, it's your career." Harper stood at her office window, looking down at the wet gleam of SW 5th Avenue, and said nothing at all. She simply hung up the phone, her thumb white-knuckled around the old steel bracelet on her wrist, the one Ryan had sanded smooth by hand over 3 nights 12 years ago, in a garage that still smelled like motor oil and grease. She thought about the version of her life where she said nothing changed, nothing. Let the case quietly die, the way careers are supposed to be protected. It would have been easy. It would have been smart, even. She thought about that version of herself for exactly as long as it took to put her coat on, and then she walked out of the office and didn't look back. She went back to the shop that night after everyone had gone to bed. She told herself she needed one more file from Ryan's desk. That wasn't really the reason, and some part of her knew it. What she found in his top drawer stopped her cold. Dozens of envelopes, old ones, worn soft at the edges, addressed to a P.O. box in Beaverton, the one address Harper had kept steady through 6 different placements over the years. The one detail about her life that never changed, no matter how many times everything else did. No return name, just cash, folded small, sent quietly for years by a man who had never once tried to explain himself, never once asked for anything back. Behind the workbench, a small room she hadn't set foot in since she was 17 sat exactly as she'd left it. Same narrow bed, same faded quilt. A few of her old things still arranged the way she'd arranged them the last night she slept there, as if the room had simply been waiting patiently for someone to come home. And pinned behind the tool cabinet, gone soft and yellow with age, was the drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands. Harper sank down onto the concrete floor of the garage and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in 12 years. Not composed, not careful. Nothing like the woman who stood up in courtrooms and dismantled other people's lies. She understood, finally, sitting there in the dark, she had never been abandoned. Ryan had quietly kept a place for her the entire time, sending money he could barely spare, never once explaining, never once asking to be thanked. For 12 years, Harper had built her whole adult life on one quiet, protective belief that needing people was how you got left. So the safest thing was to never need anyone again. Sitting on that concrete floor, she understood the belief had been a lie the entire time. The leaving had never been about her being unworthy of staying, only about a system too clumsy to see what Ryan had already seen. The grief and the relief arrived tangled together because a person cannot mourn 12 wasted years of guardedness without also grieving the version of herself who might have come home years sooner. She wiped her face and something inside her hardened back into resolve. The next morning, Harper traced the source of a mysterious hospital fund that had been quietly covering long-term medical bills at Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center treatment for the son of Kevin R., the city clerk who'd altered the traffic report. The money traced back cleanly and unmistakably to a shell account controlled by Derek Voss. He hadn't just paid Kevin off, he'd been holding a sick child's medical care over a frightened father's head for months, a debt disguised as generosity, a leash disguised as kindness. Kevin broke down on the witness stand when the case finally reached its hearing, his voice shaking harder than his hands. He wasn't afraid of Voss anymore. He was more afraid of what his son would think of him someday if he let a lie stand between now and then. Then it was Harper's turn. The courtroom was fuller than it had been all week. Reporters, cameras, the county's whole legal community, leaning in for what everyone could tell was about to be the story of the year. Mason sat pale beside his father, close enough to the edge of custody that a deputy had already been positioned near the side door. Harper stood. Her hands were not steady, and for once she didn't try to hide it. Your Honor, before I continue, I need to disclose something about my relationship to the defendant and his family. The room went utterly silent. When I was 15 years old, I was homeless. Ryan Caldwell took me in off the street with no legal obligation to do so, and he kept me for 2.5 years until the state separated us. I am aware that disclosing this now creates a conflict of interest that could result in professional sanctions against me. I am disclosing it anyway because this family deserves the truth more than I deserve to protect my career. Somewhere behind her, a camera shutter clicked. Then another. Then a dozen at once, a soft mechanical rain filling the room. Ryan closed his eyes. 12 years, and the girl who'd once said, "You're leaving me too," had just stood up in front of the entire county and chosen publicly, permanently, to stay. Beside him, Mason reached over and gripped his father's hand under the table the way he used to when he was small and thunderstorms rolled in off the Willamette. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them needed to. Whatever the judge decided in the next few minutes, something had already shifted in that room that no ruling could undo. Kevin R.'s testimony changed everything. Combined with the timeline of the falsified traffic report, the shell company payments, and the 2.5 years of aggressive purchase inquiries against 4218 Southeast Foster Road, the picture the court now had was no longer complicated at all. It was, in the judge's own words, A coordinated effort to manufacture a legal pretext for acquiring private property through financial coercion. The criminal charge against Mason was dismissed that same afternoon. Derek Voss, meanwhile, found himself facing an entirely different set of proceedings: insurance fraud, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, the kind of charges that don't get quietly settled with a one-line filing. Mason was cleared right there on the spot. Caldwell Auto Repair, the land it sat on, and the empty chair that had waited 12 years at that kitchen table, all of it stayed exactly where it belonged. In the marble hallway outside the courtroom, Ryan pulled his son into his arms so hard Mason actually laughed, half startled, half relieved, the sound cracking open something tight that had been sitting in both their chests for weeks. "It's over," Ryan kept saying into his son's shoulder, like he needed to hear himself say it before he'd fully believe it. "It's over, kid. It's over." Mason pulled back and looked past his father over the thinning crowd until he found Harper standing there with her briefcase held against her chest like a shield. Something in his chest finally settled into place, the same crooked half-smile, the same patient eyes he used to trust with a basketball and a badly folded paper airplane. "You still owe me a rematch," he said, his voice cracking somewhere between a laugh and something closer to relief. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be. Harper's throat tightened, and for just a second the careful attorney standing in that hallway looked exactly like the girl who'd once carved a name into a piece of wood with a rusty nail. She stood a few steps back, watching the two of them, not moving any closer. Some part of her, the same part that had spent 12 years learning to need nothing from anyone, was already quietly calculating an exit. She had done her job. She had done more than her job. She had very possibly ended her own career doing it. That should have been enough. She could slip out the side doors now the way she always had before anyone had the chance to ask her to stay, and watch her disappoint them by leaving anyway. She turned to go. She'd made it almost to the elevator bank before she heard footsteps behind her, quick and uneven, the sound of a man who wasn't used to hurrying but was doing it anyway. "Harper." Ryan's voice stopped her cold right there on the marble floor, one hand still resting on Mason's shoulder. She didn't turn around right away. She stood very still, the way she used to stand at 15, bracing for whatever came next. The truth was simpler and more frightening than anything she'd argued in that courtroom all week. She was terrified. Not of Voss, not of the sanctions that might follow her disclosure, not even of losing her career. She was terrified of exactly this: of turning around, of letting herself want to stay, of building something here a second time, only to lose it again the way she'd lost it once already. Standing in the rain on this same stretch of pavement 12 years ago. If she let herself stay this time and it fell apart again, she wasn't sure there'd be anything left of her afterward to walk away with. "Harper," Ryan said again, softer now. She turned around. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Mason, sensing something bigger than himself was happening, quietly stepped back toward the courthouse doors, giving them the kind of space you learn to give people without ever being taught how. Outside past the tall windows, the sky over the Multnomah County Courthouse had gone the deep gray it gets right before Portland rain, the kind of gray that had followed Ryan Caldwell through every important moment of the last 12 years, like the city itself couldn't help but mark the occasion. By the time they stepped out onto the gray stone steps, it had started to fall. Not hard, just a fine, steady mist settling over the plaza and the parked cars and the wet flags out front. Harper stopped at the top of the steps. Ryan stopped one step below her, close enough now that she could see the same tired kindness in his eyes that she remembered from a kitchen table 12 years ago. A little more gray at the edges now. A little more worn, but unmistakably the same. He still had a faint line of grease under one thumbnail, she noticed, even dressed for court. Some things, apparently, 12 years couldn't scrub clean. "You didn't have to say any of that in there," he said. "About us. About where you came from. You could have kept it quiet and nobody would have ever known." "I know," Harper said. "Why'd you do it then?" She looked past him out at the rain settling over downtown Portland and thought about 12 years of envelopes mailed quietly to a P.O. box in Beaverton. 12 years of a chair that never once got put away. 12 years of a drawing kept pinned behind a tool cabinet where nobody but Ryan was ever supposed to see it. "Because somebody did it for me first," she said, "for 2.5 years, without ever once asking for anything back." Ryan's throat worked hard around whatever he was trying to say next. Mason, watching from just inside the courthouse doors, saw his father's shoulders drop, not in defeat this time, but in something closer to relief. The particular kind of relief that only comes after carrying a weight so long you'd forgotten what your body felt like without it. The rain kept falling soft and steady the way it always did in this city, the way it had the night a 15-year-old girl first walked into a garage on Southeast Foster Road with nowhere else to go. Neither of them moved to leave. Neither of them reached for an umbrella. There was still one thing left unsaid between them. The real reason Ryan had let her go that night 12 years ago, a reason that had nothing to do with paperwork or the state at all. Harper could see it sitting behind his eyes, whatever it was, old and heavy and not yet spoken. He was finally ready to say it out loud. And standing there in the rain, so was she ready to hear it. For the first time in 12 years, the whole rest of Portland seemed to go quiet around the two of them, narrowed down to one set of gray stone steps, one soft rain, and one long-overdue conversation that couldn't wait one more day. Ryan stood there in the rain, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, and finally asked the question that had been sitting behind his ribs for 12 years. "Why did you come back?" Harper opened her mouth to answer, but Ryan wasn't finished. He needed to say the rest first before he lost his nerve, before the rain gave him any excuse to stop. "It wasn't just the DHS paperwork that night," he said, his voice low and rough. "The night my wife died, out on I-5, I was late. I'd stopped to help a stranger with a flat tire on the shoulder, some kid who didn't have anybody else to call. 20 minutes. That's all it cost me. 20 minutes, and by the time I got there, she was already gone." He stopped, swallowed hard, made himself keep going. "After that, I told myself I was the kind of man who brings trouble down on whoever I try to hold on to. So when you looked at me that night in the rain and said I was leaving you too, I let you believe it. Because some part of me thought letting you go was the only way to keep you safe from me." The truth he'd carried for 12 years was never really about a highway or bad timing. It was about a man who'd quietly decided that love and responsibility were the same thing, and that failing at one meant he'd failed at both. Pushing Harper away hadn't been coldness, it had been the only language his guilt knew how to speak. The belief that loving someone from a safe distance was kinder than loving them close enough to lose them, too. Saying it out loud, finally, cost him more than any hearing had. Because a confession admits the fear was real. And real fears don't disappear just because a man decides to stop obeying them. The rain kept falling quiet and steady between them. Harper looked at him for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft, but it didn't waver at all. "The man who taught me to change a tire in the rain never once stopped being my father just because a piece of paper expired," she said. "And you were never the trouble, Ryan. You were the reason I'm still standing here at all." Neither of them said anything else for a while. Ryan felt his eyes go hot and blurry, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let it happen. No swallowing it down, no turning away to hide it. He just stood there on the courthouse steps and cried quietly, the way a man cries when 12 years of something finally sets itself down. Somewhere behind them, through the courthouse doors, Mason watched the whole thing without saying a word, arms crossed loosely over his chest, doing his best not to grin too wide about it. He'd waited a long time to see his father's shoulders unclench like that. He figured he could give the man this one moment without teasing him about it, at least, until dinner. Harper stepped forward and took his hand, the same hand that had once sanded a steel bolt smooth over 3 late nights, the same hand that had changed 1,000 oil filters and wiped down one empty chair every single Sunday for 12 years running. She didn't pull him into a long embrace. She didn't need to. She just held on and gave one small, certain nod. And that was enough. It said everything a hug might have said, and said it better. This story reminds us that family was never really about the paperwork. It's about who still shows up long after the world says they don't have to. Maybe there's someone you quietly made room for, once a niece who needed a couch for a summer, a neighbor's boy who ate dinner at your table more nights than his own, A grandkid out in Denver or Atlanta you haven't called since things got awkward after the divorce. You don't need a speech to tell them the door's still open. This Sunday, set that extra place at the table anyway, the way Ryan never stopped doing, even for a chair nobody sat in. Dig the recipe box out of the hall closet, find the card with the coffee ring from some Thanksgiving years back, and mail it with 4 words tucked inside. Still your favorite. Come make it. Leave the porch light on an hour later than usual on a night you know they might be struggling, even if you never say why. And if you're the one standing on the far side of a door you closed yourself, it isn't too late to knock. Pick one Sunday this month. Dial the number you've been avoiding. Say only this: "I've been thinking about you. Can I come by?" That's the whole call. You don't owe anyone 12 years of explanation in a single conversation, any more than Ryan and Harper owed each other one on a courthouse step in the rain. Grief doesn't close a door by itself. Fear usually does that quietly, while grief is still in the room trying to warn you off getting hurt twice. Undoing that fear rarely looks dramatic. It looks like a second plate, a stamped envelope, a porch light left on an hour longer than it needs to be. Small, steady, unglamorous proof that the chair is still there, dusted every Sunday, waiting for whoever finally decides to come home. 3 months later, the little wooden sign above the workbench had a fresh coat of paint. Family only. Ryan, Mason, and Harper. The letters bright again after 12 faded years. Every Friday evening now, without fail, Harper came back to the house on Southeast Foster Road for dinner, and the 4th chair at the table finally had somewhere it belonged. The Mustang never made it to its buyer. After the accident, Ryan quietly refunded the deposit and parked the finished car back in its corner of the garage, engine tuned and idling, clean keys hung on their hook, going nowhere. Nobody talked much about selling it after that. Some things you just keep the way you keep a bracelet made from an old steel bolt, or a drawing gone soft and yellow behind a tool cabinet. One quiet, rainy afternoon, Harper stood alone in the old waiting room, looking at the same cracked plastic chair she'd once curled up on at 15 years old, soaked through and certain she had nowhere left to go. Miss Betty waved at her through the front window on her way past with a casserole dish for somebody down the block, same as she'd done for 30 years. And Harper found herself waving back like she'd been doing it her whole life. She smiled. This time, for the first time in 12 years, nothing about that chair felt like being left behind at all. It just felt like home. The kind you don't have to earn twice once you've finally been allowed to keep it. This story was written by a human accompanied by AI. It exists to remind us that even when wrongly judged or treated unfairly, kindness and resilience can still change everything, because life and family always reserve their rightful rewards for those who never lose their dignity.